Welcome to another episode of Summa Made Simple, in which we shall be looking at question 150 of the second part of Summa Theologica by St. Thomas Aquinas, which considers 4 articles around the vice of drunkenness. This is one of those topics which is kind of perennial, so it has a lot of relevance for the contemporary man on the street. First article, whether drunkenness is a sin. So as usual, he starts by giving objections that would say, no, drunkenness is not a sin. And then he'd go on to explain why drunkenness is a sin. So let's go into those. Objection 1, it would seem that drunkenness is not a sin. For every sin has a corresponding contrary sin. Thus, timidity is opposed to daring and presumption to pusillanimity, but no sin is opposed to drunkenness. Therefore, drunkenness is not a sin. In other words, when you look at every sin, a sin lives at an extreme of something. And usually, there's also the other extreme, and both of those are sins. So, for instance, the examples it gives here is cowardice or timidity is opposed to daring or foolhardiness, and, where someone is so afraid that they never do what they're supposed to do. Or the other extreme is someone who never thinks things through and just takes like unnecessary risks. Or presumption and pusillanimity. Presumption, that state where someone reaches for things which are beyond their ability, usually out of a sense of pride. Or pusillanimity, where a person, usually out of a sense of cowardice or comfort, does not do the things which are well within their ability to do. So they kind of shirk their responsibilities. So he's saying that if there is no like opposite extreme for drunkenness, therefore it cannot be a sin. Objection 2, further, every sin is voluntary. But no man wishes to be drunk, since no man wishes to be deprived of the use of reason. Therefore, drunkenness is not a sin. In other words, when someone is drunk, they're always somehow, somewhere trying to regain control of things, whether it's even just to drive themselves or walk in a straight line or something, or even sober up. Like they're always trying to get back into control. So that's what he means, that they are aware, kind of, that they've lost the use of reason and no one wants to remain in that state. Therefore, drunkenness is not a sin. Objection 3, further, whoever causes another to sin, sins himself. Therefore, that's an important principle to remember. Whoever causes someone else to sin, sins himself. Therefore, if drunkenness were a sin, it would follow that it is a sin to ask a man to drink that which makes him drunk, which would seem very, very hard. A place in Scripture where Jesus Christ alludes to this is when he says, if you make any of these little ones sin, referring to children, it would be better for that person to have a millstone tied around his neck and be cast into the sea. Meaning, if you make children sin, that's like, it's better that you had not been born. So that idea that if you make someone sin, you yourself commit a sin. And we're saying that our Lord in that context was saying one of the worst sins you can make others do is when you make children sin. But that's a principle here. So if someone gives someone else alcohol to drink and that person gets drunk, then that person who gave him alcohol has also committed a sin. And that seems like, that's draconian, right? So it's such a hard teaching, it cannot be a sin. Therefore, drunkenness is not a sin. Otherwise, every waiter and bartender and waitress on earth would be guilty of this at some stage. Objection 4, further, every sin calls for correction. But correction is not applied to drunkards. For Gregory, St. Gregory says that we must forbear with their ways, lest they become worse if they be compelled to give up the habit. Therefore, drunkenness is not a sin. Why? Because we should never ever forbear with a sin. But St. Gregory the Great said, no, when it comes to drunkenness, we should forbear with it. Therefore, it cannot be a sin. We'll go into the replies to those 4 objections, but for now, St. Thomas says, on the contrary, the apostle says in Romans chapter 13, verse 13, not in rioting and drunkenness, and he continues to say, not in, another translation of that is not in orgies and drunkenness. And then he continues to say, not in debauchery, and basically he's speaking about how we should live as Christians and behaviors we should leave behind. St. Thomas says, I answer that. Drunkenness may be understood in 2 ways. So as usual, it's the nuance. The nuances are very important when it comes to this. And he's going to give kind of 2 descriptions. Let's not say definitions, but 2 descriptions of drunkenness. Let's get into them. Drunkenness may be understood in 2 ways. First, it may signify the defect itself. It may signify the defect itself of a man resulting from his drinking much wine, the consequence being that he loses the use of reason. In this sense, drunkenness denotes not a sin but a penal defect resulting from a fault. What does he mean by this? A person who explains this concept very well is Archbishop Fulton Sheen. In one of his sermons, he says that natural law, is meant to be followed, is meant to be obeyed. What is natural law? You know, you and I were born into this world, and we came into this world and found things working in a certain way just naturally, like what goes up must come down, fire burns, etc. So if someone attempts to disobey natural law by abusing the things which they find in nature, both within themselves and outside of themselves, nature always exerts a punishment, either in the short term or in the long term. So, for instance, when it comes to the use of alcohol is something which one finds in nature. It occurs naturally. I mean, for instance, if you leave fruits just to ferment, they can have an amount of alcohol within them that develops within them. It's a natural thing. Fermentation is a natural thing, right? And nature, in a sense, natural law has it that the use of alcohol in limited quantities is supposed to be beneficial to the person who uses it. But however, if they abuse that natural law that alcohol should be used in limited quantities, nature will pay you back for it. So the result of that is nature will allow you to become the animal which you've allowed yourself to become by letting you lose the use of reason. So that's what he means when he says drunkenness is a penal defect. It's a punishment which nature metes out whenever we abuse the nature of anything. Whenever you abuse the nature of anything, usually that punishment for abusing that nature of something is going to come either in the short term or in the long term. So that's what he's speaking about here. Secondly, drunkenness may denote the act by which a man incurs this defect. So the first one is saying drunkenness can refer to a state of being. And then secondly, drunkenness can refer to an action. Now, this is an important distinction to make. And at a higher level, what it's alluding to is that it's very difficult. In fact, I can't think of any sin which is a result of a state of being. Sin is always the result of a voluntary action, not because of a way of being. And this is an important concept to understand, especially when it comes to the whole debate around homosexuality. When you understand this concept, it becomes very, very clear that the reason when someone says, oh, homosexuality is a sin, they're not referring to a state of an emotional state of experiencing same-sex attraction. No, that is not a sin. A state is not a sin. It's an action. Whenever a person then does something, whenever someone carries out an action, that is where sin is to be found. So there is no sin in having same-sex attraction. There is a sin in carrying out actions which satisfy or make that same-sex attraction play out in an action, whether that action is in the imagination internally, whether it's in your body externally, whatever it is. So the sin is always in an action. This is an important principle to keep in mind. It's not in states, it's in actions. Continuing, this act may cause drunkenness in two ways. In one way, through the wine being too strong without the drinker being aware of this, and in this way drunkenness may occur without sin, especially if it is not through his negligence, and thus we believe that Noah was made drunk as related in Genesis chapter 9. So in other words, this action by which a man becomes drunk, which is also the second description of drunkenness. So drunkenness is the state, or drunkenness can be the action. Now the action of drunkenness, of going into the state of drunkenness, can happen in two ways. The first is when, without the person being aware that the wine was too strong, drinks more than he or she should, not just wine, but alcohol in general, has more than they should, and as a result they become drunk. And in that sense, especially if it is not due to that person's negligence, it is still not a sin. So, in which situation is the action of drinking too much alcohol a sin? It's in this way. In another way, drunkenness may result from disordered desire for the pleasure that comes from consuming alcohol. That's what St. Thomas means when he says from inordinate concupiscence and use of wine. In this way, it is accounted a sin and is comprised under gluttony as a species under its genus. So, in other words, you remember gluttony has to do with everything that concerns the disordered desire for the pleasures of the palate, for the pleasures of taste. That is gluttony in general. Now, within it, you've got different subcategories, as it were. One of these is drunkenness, disordered desire for the pleasures of the palate when it comes to the drinking of alcoholic beverages. That's what drunkenness is, and in that sense is where it is a sin. So again, it has to do with the action where someone gives in to a desire that is not ordered, not directed towards the purpose for which alcohol exists. In that sense, it is a sin. So reply to the first objection. You remember in the first objection, Saint Thomas says that drunkenness does not have a contrary vice or a contrary sin that lives on the other extreme. So it cannot be a defect. It cannot be a sin. But here's the reply to that objection. As the philosopher says, insensibility is opposed to temperance, and it is not very common. So that, like its species, which are opposed to the species of intemperance, it has no name. In other words, he's saying it does exist. This vice that's the opposite extreme of drunkenness does exist. It's just so uncommon that humanity has never bothered to give it a name over the centuries. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just so uncommon. There's no name for this thing in human language. Hence, the vice opposed to drunkenness is unnamed. And yet, if a man were knowingly to abstain from wine to the extent of molesting nature grievously, he would not be free from sin. It's such a rare thing, but imagine a situation where your doctor tells you, listen, for the purposes of your health and your heart and etc., you need to drink a little bit of wine with every meal. And then you disdain that and you're contemptuous of it because of you're not able in your mind to direct your senses towards this goal, which is your entire integrity, your bodily good. So you're unable completely to get your mind to control all of your desire, in this case, your desire that hates wine, your desire against wine, your aversion to alcohol, and then to have a little bit for the purposes of your health. And that's basically saying that is such a rare thing that there isn't even a name for it in the human language, in human languages, but if such a thing were to occur, that person would not be free from sin. So I like the way he phrases that. It doesn't say he commits a sin. He says he would not be free from sin. He just leaves a gap there saying it's possible, it's likely, it's probable, but no one can say for certain. This is also another very important thing when it comes to thinking and discussing about sins, etc. No one can ever say for certain that, you can say for certain this is a sin, but you cannot say for certain this person has sinned. See, there's an element there where no human being can read the intentions and the inner sanctum of another human being, as it were. Second objection. The second objection had it said that every sin is voluntary, but no man wishes to be drunk, since no man wishes to be deprived of the use of reason. Therefore, drunkenness is not a sin. The response to that is the objection regards the resulting state, the resulting defect, which is involuntary. However, the immoderate use of wine, the action that leads to that state is voluntary, and that is where sin results. The third objection says, whoever causes another to sin, sins himself. Therefore, if drunkenness were a sin, it would follow that it is a sin to ask a man to drink that which makes him drunk, which would seem very hard. And the reply to that objection is, even as he that is drunk is excused if he knows not the strength of the wine, this is something which we spoke about earlier, remember? So too is he that invites another to drink excused from sin, if he be unaware that the drinker is the kind of person to be made drunk by the drink offered. But if ignorance be lacking, in other words, if the person knows that if I give this friend of mine this alcohol, he is so sensitive or his alcohol tolerance is so low that half a glass of wine will, make him completely drunk, and I still give him that half a glass of wine. I know it's an extreme example. Very few people are like that. I don't know of anyone who's like that, but just to clarify the point. If I give someone alcohol, knowing full well that either that person cannot handle it because even the tiniest quantity would make him drunk, or because he or she is an alcoholic and will not be able to stop. If I do that, then I will not be excused from sin. That is a point here. So it's got a lot again to do with knowledge. It's got a lot to do with knowledge. So I guess this is what applies to a good bartender or a good waitress. When they see a person is drunk in a bar or a pub or wherever, a restaurant, if they carry on giving that person alcohol and that person says, put it on my tab, I don't care, I'm going to pay for it, I'm good. If they just keep on, following orders and doing their job, they will not be free. They will not be excused from sin. So I'm not saying they've committed a sin. I'm saying that there's a high likelihood, there's a high probability. So a person in that situation, a waitress, a bartender, has to say, listen, sorry, sir, you are drunk. I can get you an Uber, I can get you a cab, I can call someone to come pick you up, but I am not serving you any more alcohol. Reply to objection 4. The fourth objection, this was an interesting one. Every sin calls for correction, but correction is not applied to drunkards, for Gregory says that we must forbear with their ways, lest they become worse if they be compelled to give up the habit. Therefore, drunkenness is not a sin. And the reply to that objection kind of clarifies it. It says, sometimes the correction of a sinner is to be foregone. In other words, you don't have to correct a sinner in every instance, as stated in a previous question. Hence, Augustine says in a letter, meseems, or in other words, it seems to me, such things are cured not by bitterness, severity, harshness, but by teaching rather than commanding, by advice rather than threats. Such is the course to be followed with the majority of sinners. Few are they whose sins should be treated with severity. So, in other words, just because of this teaching from St. Augustine, which again is echoed by St. Gregory, it does not mean that the thing is not a sin. Just because we should treat drunkards with a level of we shouldn't be harsh, we shouldn't be bitter, we shouldn't be cruel, we shouldn't be mean towards them, but rather we should treat them with an element of, I don't want to say kid gloves, but let's say offering them advice rather than threats. Let me just use the word St. Augustine uses. Teaching rather than commanding, by advice rather than threats. Such is, of course, to be followed with the majority of sinners. So that doesn't mean that what they did is not a sin. It's a sin. But that doesn't mean that now we have to come down and harden them like a ton of bricks. Interesting that this was written by St. Augustine. St. Augustine lived around 300 something, right? 300 ADs, 300 ADs, like just towards the fall of the Roman Empire, which is something he witnessed, but Western Roman Empire. But having said that, it's interesting how, if you look at the church now, like I know a lot of Catholic church, I know a lot of Catholics who kind of say, no, the church needs to come out really strongly against this, and it really needs to like be stricter about that, etc., and mete out punishment, etc. But one gets a sense that what St. Augustine wrote in the 300s, it's taken the church like, a millennium and, a good 700 years plus over a millennium to like apply this thing that, let's not be harsh, let's not be draconian, let's not be mean, let's not be bitter, severe, or harsh, but let us teach rather than command, and let us give advice rather than issue threats. This doesn't sit well with a certain subgroup of Catholics who are always like, no, we gotta go fire and brimstone all the time. We gotta go DEFCON 5 on everyone all the time. Well, St. Augustine himself has something different to say about that.